Please do come to the front. Friendly.
Okay, so we'll let people wander in because we don't want to be too much behind schedule because there's a lot of really important material to talk about. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to tonight's discussion, Migration and Public Security. My name is Tony Gilland and I'm the Chief of Staff at MCC Brussels. We all know that migration is a key topic going into the European elections in June, and it presents significant challenges for many national governments. However, there are many aspects of migration and issues arising from it that are rarely discussed in open public debate, and from which the media shy away from providing full public disclosure. Raising questions and concerns linked to migration about everything from terror attacks to gang violence or sexually predatory behaviour can quickly lead to those raising the questions being shouted down as racist or accused of fanning the flames of Islamophobia. Even though it's not entirely clear what Islamophobia means, brandishing the word can operate as a very effective gagging order and a requirement to self-censorship. So as your chair for this evening, it's my job to ensure that does not happen tonight. We at MCC Brussels believe it's perfectly possible, correct, and indeed important to discuss these topics in an honest, respectful, and rigorous way. Here, free speech is allowed, and indeed it's encouraged. So, to help us get started exploring this topic, we have two excellent speakers. First to speak will be Dr. Rakib Ehsan on my far left. Rakib kindly agreed to speak last week when, due to a genuine emergency, Dr. Simon Cottee informed us that he would not be able to join us. We are very grateful to Rakib, who is very well qualified to speak on tonight's topic. Rakib has written widely on the failures of multiculturalism and Britain's broken migration and asylum systems. I would highly recommend his recent articles for the online publication Spiked, where he addresses many of the issues we'll discuss tonight, and specifically the failures of the UK asylum system exposed by the recent acid attacks in London. As Rakib has written, the suspect, Abdul Azedi, was a 35-year-old Afghan and someone whose asylum application was rejected twice. Yet, despite being convicted for sexual assault and indecent exposure, he was successful in his third asylum application, having converted to Christianity, and been vouched for by a priest. Rakib is also the author of Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. It's a book which provides much needed corrective to the toxic mixture of tribal identity politics and radical cultural liberalism on the modern left. So thank you for being with us, Rakib. Second to speak will be Dr. Florence Bergeaud-Blackler. Florence is an esteemed anthropologist and research fellow at Sciences et Lettres Université. She has studied the Muslim Brotherhood for 30 years and published several books on how the halal standard was constructed over time and how it became a political, religious instrument in the hands of Muslim fundamentalists. Most recently, she authored the acclaimed study, Le Frérisme et ses réseaux, L'Enquête. Doesn't translate, it was probably not the best job, but I did my best. It doesn't translate easily into English, but it's essentially brotherism, or it's the ideology extending from the Muslim Brotherhood and its networks, and it's an investigation of that. So we're looking forward very much, Florence, to that. So Florence's study traces the growth of the Islamist movement out of the internationalization of the Muslim Brotherhood and shows how the movement is extending its reach into the very heart of European societies. Florence has been highly commended for both the rigor and bravery with which she has conducted her research and dissemination. And we're delighted to have you with us tonight. Okay, so Rakib and Florence will speak for a maximum of 15 minutes each. I will ask a couple of follow-up questions, and then I'll come out to you, the audience. So please, have your points ready. We want and expect to hear from you. So, thank you. Please give our speakers a big round of applause. Just take my seat, Rakib, and then... Okay, the floor is yours.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight's event and braving the harsh elements of Brussels tonight. I'd also like to thank MCC Brussels for once again inviting me to speak, albeit at very short notice. I think in terms of the sound...
Cutting in and out.
Yeah. You can hear fine? Okay. So in terms of the event itself, in terms of my research background, I look at the security elements of immigration and asylum. So I think this is a part of the debate which I feel is often overlooked, Tony, if truth be told. I think quite often people reduce immigration to very economistic arguments, and some of those arguments are quite often deeply flawed. I'll speak more from a UK perspective, because that's ultimately where I'm from. I think in recent times in the UK, I think what we've seen is the debate on immigration being somewhat simplistic, and I'll explain why. I think that when the British political establishment traditionally has used immigration in a way to stimulate economic growth, which has also been proven to be a deeply flawed theory, because for a long time the UK has had a high immigration, low growth economic model. But from a security perspective, we have fundamental flaws especially in terms of our asylum system. I'm firmly of the view that an asylum system is primarily designed to provide sanctuary for the world's most persecuted peoples. That's clearly not the case, especially when it comes to the UK's asylum system. I'm sure people are aware of the small boats emergency which is taking place on the English south coast, which in my view is a national scandal in itself in terms of how it's been so badly managed. But with our immigration system and asylum regime, I think the clearest problem for me is that there's been a blurring of the line between a genuine refugee who is fleeing immediate persecution and violence in their homeland and an economic migrant. I think this is the fundamental problem at the heart of the UK's immigration and asylum regime. Now, for me, in terms of the UK's asylum system, in my view, women and girls at risk of sexual violence in their homelands, especially in conflict-ridden territories in the Middle East, but also parts of Africa, are being left by the wayside because our asylum system is so overrun by male-dominant illegal migration. So the asylum system has become oversaturated with asylum claims from people who I would consider to be illegal economic migrants. And on top of that, we have legislation such as modern slavery legislation, which in my view is badly designed, which is being exploited by a significant number of asylum claimants. And what's also the worry is how those seeking asylum, some of those illegally entering the country, how they're distributed within the UK. And I'll be very interested to hear conversations over the course of the evening in terms of whether these patterns are also similar in other European countries. But when it comes to how asylum seekers are rehomed in the UK, illegal migrants are being rehomed, quite often it's the most deprived parts of the UK, the poorest parts of the UK, where they're being distributed and rehomed, at great cost as well. Recent estimates in terms of rehoming asylum seekers, there have been estimates have gone up to £8 million a day, which is a considerable amount of public finance in the middle of a cost of living crisis. To put in perspective, in recent times, the amount of money that's being spent to rehome asylum seekers and illegal migrants has nearly been 3 to 4 times larger than the amount of money being spent to tackle homelessness in the UK. So there's certainly a fairness and justice issue here. But of course, ultimately, we're here to talk about security issues. And in recent times, the Home Office, which is ultimately in charge of preserving and consolidating the UK's national security, has admitted that it's not aware of the whereabouts of thousands of asylum seekers. They have no contact with them. They have no clue where they are. And I think this is a very serious problem in terms of labour market exploitation. It could be fueling the black economy in the UK. But also, we're not entirely sure what their previous loyalties were. Many of the people within the small boats emergency were undocumented illegal migrants. No clue truly of who they are, what their previous organisational affiliations were. Indeed, many do originate from hotbeds of Islamist radicalisation, conflict-ridden territories in the Middle East. So there's a fundamental security issue here. And I think that we're also looking at matters of social cohesion. As I discussed earlier, if so many of those people entering the country, in my view many unfairly entering the country, are then relocated to the poorest parts of the country, poorest parts of the UK, which have been starved of meaningful public investment for decades, then that can certainly pose a threat to social solidarity in those areas and the nation at large. So ultimately, looking from a UK perspective, there's a number of debates to be had ahead of our own general election. What should the UK's relationship be in regards to the European Convention on Human Rights and also the 1951 Refugee Convention? In my view, the UK at the very least should try to spearhead a process of modernisation of these conventions and treaties, Many of these were ratified and signed off in the early 1950s. We live in a very different world now where there's unprecedented levels of international movement. But if it is the case that the UK fails in its objectives to modernise these treaties and conventions in line with its own national interest, then it has to consider its position, its relationship with those treaties and conventions, and indeed its membership and attachment to more supranational oriented bodies. So I think what we're really talking about here, Tony, is what should the democratic nation state represent? What is its key responsibilities? In my view, protecting the law-abiding majority is at the heart of responsible democratic governance at the nation-state level. But there's also a responsibility of local bodies in terms of tackling people smuggling infrastructures. There's something that local police forces, but also organisations such as the National Crime Agency, they need to have the powers, but also the will to tackle that. But also we have an issue with illegal businesses that profit, make very handsome profits from illegal migration. They need to face much stiffer penalties when they're caught out. And we also have issues when it comes to the housing market as well, where you actually have people, unscrupulous landlords leasing their properties, knowing that people are, their tenants have illegal status in the country. So what we need to do, we need to tackle what I call the illegal immigration complex in the UK, which doesn't only include the people smuggling infrastructures, those people smuggling gangs, but also exploitative bosses that operate in the black economy, and also those unscrupulous landlords that profit very handsomely from illegal migration as well. So I look forward to talking about those topics in greater detail over the course of the evening, but those are my initial thoughts, especially in relation to the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rakib. Florence, please.
Thank you. My speech will be very different. I apologize first for my English, very French English, I'm sorry. My interest is towards the Muslim Brotherhood and the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood I call brotherism. Amongst the breaks into the obstacles to the assimilation today is not just the flux, the high number of migration, but it's also an ideology which has spread from the 1960s now, so it's a long time ago, 60 years ago, which can be summarized in one document you can read in internet, and this document is written by ISESCO, and ISESCO is the equivalent of UNESCO for the United Nations, but for OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So in the ISESCO has published a document, I think it was 2000 published, from Qatar, and it's called Strategy for Islamic Cultural Action in the West. And in this document it's clearly said that the Muslim population born in Europe should not assimilate, must not assimilate. And it's very clearly said how the Muslim countries should act in order to reach this goal, to prevent all Muslim to assimilate in Europe. So I would like, you can see, I'm not going to go into this document, you can see it in internet, but I would like to talk about the ideology which is, I think, at the origin of this document. But first of all, I would like to precise that my first encounter with the Muslim Brotherhood was 30 years ago. I was a student preparing a master in anthropology in the University of Bordeaux, and I didn't know anything about the brothers because in France at that time nobody thought they were present in Europe. And even now you still hear people in the university to explain you that the Muslim Brotherhood never reached the European coasts, which is of course wrong. The Muslim Brotherhood is a brotherhood completely secret, but is very active, and it's maybe in France on 9 million of Muslims. Muslim Brotherhood is maybe few thousand, 10,000, which is very low numbers, but it has it controls almost all the institute of training of Islam, the school, Islamic school. They control all the institutions of transmission of Islam, and they have around them millions of Muslims who are trained by them and who are acting for them, and it's what I call the affiliated. So this structure, I explain it much more better in my book. So I wanted to, in this book, to explain this ideology, when it comes from, and where it goes. So I define brotherism, as a transnational movement that wants to conquer the world, and therefore non-Muslim countries, by first in sort of middle time between the land of Islam and toward the land of mécréant, I don't know, the unbeliever. So the European is the land of non-believer, and to make it land of Islam, there is a time where it will be a land of Sharia compatibility. So the aim is for now to make Europe, for example, but Europe first. After it will be the United States, but Europe is very interesting, but because very inclusive, by making it Sharia compatible. Its strategy of implementation and extension is very different from that of Islamist groups in Muslim countries, because it doesn't want to go through the politics, but it's based on culture and on the economy in a globalized world, dominated by the ideologies of free trade and inclusiveness. So it's very well adapted to Europe. And if you calculate the number of years the Brotherhood work outside of Muslim countries, the number of years is bigger than the number of years where the Muslim Brotherhood works in a Muslim country. What I mean is they have been much more active in Europe since 1960s than everywhere else, because they had free expression and completely a free way of disseminating their works. So the doctrine of this movement is the Wasatiyya, Islam of the Middle Way, which was theorized by Youssef el-Qaradawi. And this Sheikh Youssef el-Qaradawi was inspired by the founder of Muslim Brotherhood, of course, Hassan al-Banna, in 1928, when he created the Brotherhood, and by the Indo-Pakistani Abu Ala Maududi, born in the same year as Hassan al-Banna. The Brotherhood is not for me a theology, neither a legal school. It is what I call a system of action. What he wants to do is to steer the various theological and legal components of Sunni Islam from a middle position. It is in a middle position, and he wants to help them, to drive them to fulfill the ultimate prophecy of the establishment of the caliphate on earth. So it's a type of motor, it's an engine, it's a beating heart, and its biggest enemy is, of course, the atheism, but it's also the division, the fitna, what is dividing the ummah. So the aim is to reconstruct the ummah, and so of course the enemy is the nation state, because the nation state make boundaries. So, and the only state he wants to, the only nation it wants is the Muslim nation, which is the Ummah. So the Brotherhood in Europe uses the skills and specificities of each of the schools, the jihadi, the Sufis, the liberal, all these competencies is used and driven by this Brotherhood to direct them to the objective. So the means they use is the influence, of course, money, infiltrating the different sectors of the societies in order to modify their DNA. What they want is a theocracy. They are not theologians, they are theocrats. So, and they also works methodically, which is very interesting, by plans, by secret plans. Sometimes we discover these secret plans, and sometimes they are very open, like the document of SCENOR I was talking about before. So I think Brotherhood in non-Muslim country have adopted very different goal from the Brotherism. The Brotherism want to conquer the world, while the Islamists want to conquer a state. Brotherism doesn't want to go back to the time of the Prophet. It wants the time of the Prophet comes to the present and the future. The modern world must be changed and slowly Islamized until its Sharia compatibility. And then when society is Sharia compatible, they think that it will be so attracting that people will naturally become Muslim. So they use influence, trickery, victimization, subversion of norms and interpretations of laws. They work by plans because it is a political but also a religious movement. So this is a plan of God, which believe in the end of the world, the end of the story, the last judgment, heaven and hell. And so this is a new theory of action. And of course, a new theory of action, it's much more than just a religious practice. But maybe this is my time. I have a few minutes. Or? Okay. Okay. So in the modern society, Brotherhood has a preference for the influence through culture, through economics. The halal market is the product of Brotherism. Because the political field is not accessible for now for them, but maybe it will come. But for example, Brussels it's interesting. Brussels as a Belgian capital, all the parties are infiltrated by Muslim Brotherhood. So it will be more and more difficult for the different parties now in Brussels. I mean the French part, to be able to draw politics without having this ideology, without satisfying this ideology. But obviously nobody will notice it, because it's through influence, it's through money, it's through corruption, and it's very difficult to and nobody wants to talk to about that, of course. Okay, but I will let you.
Florence, thank you very, very much indeed. Yes, please, absolutely, 100%. There is so much in what both Florence and Rakib said. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, because I know that the audience will have lots they want to say. But first of all, just to draw out a little bit more from you, Florence, to then get Rakib's take on it. Because if I understand correctly from what you've said, and also watching some of your other presentations on videos, you're saying something quite distinct about brotherism in terms of the focus is very much, if you like, an elite institutional level. I think Florence made some very interesting comments after the French riots about, on the one hand, this is a positive for the Muslim Brotherhood in the sense that it makes clear that assimilation isn't possible, so that affirms their agenda of being opposed to assimilation. On the other hand, it's a negative because they don't want Muslim youth being associated with what is a sort of proletarianizing aspect or delinquency. They want them to be in high places and doing well in order to influence this agenda. And that's quite different from Islamic fundamentalism. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think it is a Salafi movement. It is a fundamentalist movement. They prefer, their priority is to build an elite. That's for sure. But they also need a mass. Of course, society is not built just by the elite. So the mass, when there was the riot, is able today to burn towns, cities. So at the moment, this mass is controlled by narco-traffickants and also by the Salafi and the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't want a war now because it's not ready. I mean, this is it's not because they are pacific movement, not at all. It's not because it's not ready to do it. They have no control enough, and if the police come in the cities, they will be discovered and they will lose all what they have built. So now they are tranquil. They're going very smoothly but very surely to take some quarters. So they don't want that. But it's just for now.
Okay, and so just one last question to you, then over to Rakib. So I think you were indicating in your speech that many people in high places, politicians, key business people, don't want to know this story. They'd rather not hear it. I think you're suggesting that they are complicit in some sort of tacit agreement. Can you explain a bit further?
Well, I would say some people don't see it. Some people guess that something is something like what I describe, but they don't want to know because they don't want to. They don't know what to do. So we don't want the problem we cannot solve. We don't want to know the problem we cannot solve. And you have people who know that, but who are corrupted, and if they are not able anymore to open the problem because they lose everything. They can lose their job, they can lose their security. It's very dangerous.
Okay, thanks. So, Rakib, you've written a lot about the difficulties in the UK. You've spoken about some of it just now. What's your take on what Florence is talking about?
Well, there's slightly similar dynamics in the UK. For example, I've written previously about a red-green alliance which has taken hold in the UK, which ultimately involves cooperation between radical leftists and political Islamists. But the real worry is the degree to which mainstream liberals in the British political system get sucked into that red-green alliance. And you see much rhetoric surrounding Islamophobia. The argument I've often made is that I'd say that the UK is arguably the best place to live as a Muslim, if truth be told, considering its religious freedoms, the fact that it has very strong anti-discrimination protections on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and religion. And I think there's just a lack of assertiveness in the British political system in terms of pushing back against that sort of victimhood industry, which has really taken hold in the UK. And I think the worry is that when you have that policy approach of multiculturalism, what you see is state agencies engaging with self-appointed community leaders. They're very vocal, they're very assertive, but they aren't usually accountable at all. Quite often they've never held an elected position in their lives, and they're not necessarily representative of mainstream British Muslim opinion. If you look at recent polling, it shows that the majority of British Muslims are concerned about the threat of Islamist extremism in the UK. And quite often it's because more moderate, secular-minded, pro-democracy British Muslims, they have to face Islamist intimidation in their own communities on a day-to-day basis. And quite often that's overlooked. So instead of empowering those Muslims who are patriotic, community-spirited, they respect the rule of law, they value equality of opportunity in Britain, what the UK has done, unfortunately under a model, a very, how do you say, ill-conceived model of multiculturalism, it's empowered anti-democracy organizations. I'll tell you a quite remarkable outcome where we have a scheme in the UK called Prevent. It's designed to fight terrorism. It's meant to be an anti-terrorism scheme. It was found that it actually allocated funding to a charity where the leadership appeared to express sympathy with the Taliban. This is anti-extremism funding. And I think it just shows the sort of poor due diligence. Well, I say it's poor due diligence, but we need to really work out how such an outcome can possibly come about, where British taxpayers' money, which is designed to counter extremist narratives, is then allocated to a charitable organization where the leadership expresses sympathy with the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan. So I think that what that really tells you is that there's some fundamental flaws in terms of how our model of governance works in modern Britain. And I think crucially something that Dr. Florence, if I could add to that, is that I said that what we've seen in the UK is the rise of the identitarian state, where you have, in my view, tribal ideologues worming their way into the state apparatus in the UK. And not only in spheres such as education and healthcare, but actually in the security sphere, in law and order. Indeed, providing advice to the Metropolitan Police Service in London how to approach protests and demonstrations where there's very clear displays of pro-terror paraphernalia and indeed anti-Semitic chanting. And I just find it absolutely remarkable where you have a situation where British Muslims who should be considered allies in terms of trying to cultivate social cohesion, maintain national solidarity, they're sidelined, while in my view you have radical activists with very clear Islamist appetites actually being given greater power and control under the multicultural model. And I think that that's something that will take a very long time to counter because that model has become so embedded in various spheres of British life.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Now, I know the audience is going to want to ask lots of questions, so I'm going to ask you one more question each, and then, so everybody in the audience be ready, and we'll get you all in. So I'd like to ask you, Florence, how you recognize, or do you recognize what Rakib's saying about the identitarian state?
Oh, yes.
But added to that, if that relates to, I think it's something certainly, Rakib, you've written about, and I think you've touched on yourself, Florence, about how things have changed over the last few decades. So that in the 60s and 70s, and to a certain extent even the 80s, the experience of immigrants and assimilation was actually very distinct to what it is now.
Yeah, in France we call that the politique of grand frère, big brothers. So we, because the state is not able to control the traffic, and so they put some big brothers coming from the community, and they decide, and they and actually they try to have the deputies, the mayor, in their pocket by playing this very this role in between. So they say, okay, they say to the mayor, the people want this, and they say to the people, but the mayor wants this. So they have a very big power being this intermediate. So what my colleagues say very rightly is the result of this politics from our country, from our democratic countries, but these politics has also been well thought by Muslim Brotherhood. So it's just that people went there and were used because of corruption of our democracies. We also have a brain which has played with this.
Okay, thanks very much. Excuse me, sorry, frog in my throat. Who would like to speak? Please put up your hand. Who'd like to ask a question? Right, so do we have the microphone? While you get your questions ready, and excuse my throat, I think it will recover in a moment. Okay, just because it's on live stream, we're just waiting for the microphone. It's just on its way down. So we've got a young man here with the grey top on, and this lady here with the purple jumper.
Thank you very much. So my question would be for Dr. Florence, and I would like to ask if they are so embedded in our democracies and our Western worlds, then how may we encounter them, or how may we defend our traditions or even our country for the long terms?
Okay, so we're going to collect a number of questions. If, do you have some paper? Yeah. And then this lady here, please. Thank you.
Thank you both for your perspectives. So it brought to mind the fact that we're living in a society that wants to counter these in any country now, which is bringing about the rise in populism and autocratic societies, no matter where we're from. I'm from the United States originally and living here, and from all sides, after what you've said, it's obvious that this is the pushback. This is why we're going to wind up with an autocratic society here, there, and possibly everywhere, and under that threat, because it's trying to counter that in some way. Is that correct?
Okay, thanks very much. Take a couple more. Yes, my colleague Ben Sagat.
Hello, Ben Sagat from MCC Brussels. My question, thank you very much for the presentation, and my question would go to Florence, and I would like to ask, what was the method of your research, because it's a secret society? What was the public reception of your book? And third question, you mentioned that the war is not now, but is in the future. So what do you think when the Muslim Brothers could consider that this is their time to act?
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. And anybody else at this point over? And there's a whole bunch of people on the far right over there. My far, so stage right. Well, you know, I've been reading too much Politico, and it's just, you know, it's rubbed off on me. No, okay, all right. So we'll take those answers first. Would you like to go first, Florence? So you have the question about how to defend tradition. And the question about the rise in populism and in response to this?
We are in multicultural and multi-religion societies. Things have changed. So how to defend our traditions? What do you mean by tradition? So it Well, no, it's not because they want an Islamic state, they will have an Islamic state. But the thing is that they will try, they are trying, and they will do their best to go toward it. So the best thing for me to defend ourselves is to know them, to learn to know them, even if it's sort of legalist Islamism, which act inside the law. We need to have more studies about them, to alleviate the taboo around them. So that's the first thing, know your enemy. And then you can reduce, reduce him. That's only thing I would advise. How my method for studying the Muslim Brothers, I started 30 years ago, and 30 years ago they were not very hidden. It was very easy if you were an anthropology student to go into their mosque, to follow them in training, to be with them, and it's the job of an anthropologist to do what we call the observation and participation. So I was with them, and of course they were not saying. I mean, one time I asked them, "Are you a Muslim Brotherhood?" And of course they smiled and they said nothing. Yes, we are brothers in Islam, but it was obvious by what they were reading, how they behave, what they wanted. They wanted not just a mosque, but an Islamic center. And if you read the brothers' literature at this time, it was very easy to make the link. It's after when they try to be. When we talk about Muslim Brothers after 2001 and after 2015, that they became completely silent, and they started to open, for example, not anymore the Islamic Association of something, but the association of I don't know, of Bordeaux. They went completely banalisé, invisible. They started to have very invisible activities. But as a woman, you can go, for example, in some hairdresser when actually they give lessons of Islamic lessons. You can go to some of events around beauty, and you can see the sisters, because there is brothers, but there are also sisters. And so it's the way I survey. When I said it's their times, when you say their times, it's already their time. They are working every day, but they have a preference for peaceful means, because they are not in a good balance of force. They are too weak for now. So as long as they are weak, they will act peacefully. But of course, when the relation will be more favorable, then there's no break. I mean, there's no, because they want the theocracy. They really want it. So don't think that they will just give up on deciding. They really want it.
Okay. And any response to the question about a rise in populism? Are you concerned about a rise in populism, or is that actually maybe something that might make people more?
What do you mean by populism exactly?
Well, I think that do you want to just quickly say what you mean by populism?
I literally mean non-democratic in the sense that
Okay.
we use it. So you can use autocracy, populist, any of the other.
Yes, of course. I mean, repression and violence is calling for repression and violence. So, of course, if the state is not making its work, means that make order, of course, people will defend themselves, and you will have some phenomenon like you described, of course.
Okay, thanks very much. Rakib.
Well, I think in terms of the debate on populism, in some ways you could describe it as very pro-democracy, in a sense that maybe the rise in populism in certain countries is in response to greater power and control being allocated to and transferred to unelected bodies, unaccountable institutions. So in that sense, it could be a desire for a reinvigoration of democracy is what's driving populism. I think in terms of the debate on heritage, history and traditions, I think there's many Western countries who have political establishments which are dominated by individuals who are actually very insecure about their own heritage, history and traditions, which is precisely why they're unable to be assertive in terms of defending them. In the UK, you have many politicians who are very, for example, very insecure over the history of British colonialism. And I'm sure that that might exist in other European countries, those kind of dynamics as well. And I think that when you have a political system which is dominated by individuals who are quite unwilling, actually, to defend a country's history, its contributions to the world, its traditions, in the UK in terms of our parliamentary constitutional monarchy. How did that come about? How that's developed over time? Even insecurity over the UK's record on race relations, which I think actually overall is very positive. Dare I have to say, I think the UK is far advanced when compared to the US when it comes to matters of race. I think that the US is a country which is still struggling to get to grips with that legacy of slavery and segregation, and the UK has a very different history. It's a very different national context. So I think I know this sounds very UK based, but this is ultimately my own personal experience, that I think in Britain what would really help is you need to have a robust civic nationalism at the very least, a very muscular one, in order to tie together that diversity, because we are a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-faith democracy now in the UK. That's just the reality of it. But I think that if you allow that kind of, and it's with the gentleman's question there in terms of how do we go about countering this, firstly, don't appoint them in state institutions in positions of influence. That's the truth of it. You have tribal ideologues who don't have social cohesion at heart. They don't have national democracy at heart. Quite often their appetites are quite anti-democracy. Those views need to be confronted. They don't need to be put into the heart of the state apparatus and in very important institutions of influence. So I think there needs to be a very serious pushback there. But I think the reason why we're not seeing that kind of pushback is because there's far too many people in the political establishment who are unwilling to do so. They lack the bravery and courage, and some of them actually pander to those identitarian interests because it might suit them electorally to do so.
Okay, thanks very much, Rakib. Great, so we've got a few more hands up. We'll take my colleague at the front here, Richard, and there's another hand here from, we have Patricia Chagnon with us from MEP. Please, Richard first.
Yeah, thank you very much. My first question is for Mrs. Bergeaud-Blackler. Many Muslim countries, especially in the Middle East, like the United Arab Emirates, are cracking down very hard on the Muslim Brotherhood. And is this even, I mean, they're using very often non-democratic means to crack down on the Muslim Brotherhood, but can we somehow learn from them how to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood? And the second one is to Mr. Ehsan. Doctor, yeah. Doctor Ehsan. You mentioned these international treaties like the Genf treaties on migration and asylum, that they have this almost sacred status. How can we change them? I mean, is there any possibility that we see countries agreeing on a new model for asylum and migration in future?
Thank you very much, Richard. Patricia Chagnon, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bergeaud-Blackler, d'être avec nous. Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en anglais, mais voilà, je suis une de vos compatriotes. Thank you very much for being with us today. I have a question for both of you. I was living in Sudan already in 1980s with the Islamic Revolution. I have seen an increase all over the Middle East, but also in Asia, of rising Islam. And when I came back to France in 1998, since I have been very astonished to see that, well, of course, as Dr. Bergeaud-Blackler says, the Muslim Brotherhood controls the Islamic institutions, or the mosques, or even the Muslim institutions. They control the populations. But what do the people do? They vote. And I see that it's become very problematic that there are swing votes in Muslim populations that are being instrumentalized at different elections. And I keep asking myself for the past 20 years, how are we going to go about this problem of the control of large parts of the voters in local elections and regional elections and national elections? Should we not look at a way how we can make local politicians responsible for fighting radical Islam in their communities? Because today it seems no one is responsible. You find a radical mosque, it's been given a permit, it's getting subsidies from the government, and when you tackle them in front of the court, you get nowhere because no one's responsible. Is there any idea that you both have on how we could treat the problem of making community leaders, local politicians responsible for what's happening in their constituencies.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, another gentleman at the front, please.
So my question is also to Dr. Florence. And I just wanted to ask, you alluded to the fact that in the 1960s or 70s, when you first started looking at the Islamic Brotherhood, they were using much more the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech that exists in Europe, and that now they have gone more underground or more silent, as you said, banalisé, and taken to more peaceful means, which actually doesn't sound that bad. But I was wondering, surely the freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which is a basic value of Europe, I would say, that should be reinstated for them as well, and they should be able to engage in open public debate, and I mean that for everyone. So if someone is on the other side of a political spectrum, be that on the further end of the right, let's say, stage right, or in the middle, moderates, surely that public debate should be encouraged, right, in all across the European Union and Britain, I'm sure, as well.
Okay, great, thanks very much. Take one or two more. Yes, there's a lady there towards the back in the dark jumper.
This is a question for both of you. It would be, who finances the Brotherhood to put them in those positions of power, and where do the profits ultimately go, and to whom?
Thank you very much. And yes, sorry to make you run around, Philippe. It's Agnieszka, my colleague at the front.
Agnieszka, colleague, MCC Brussels. I've been to many events in the past with other specialists at Research Muslim Brotherhood. And what struck me the most was that the governmental institutions don't communicate with each other. So let's say the security world would be much more aware of what's happening and monitor it. But then let's say education or anything related to elections and so on, they would be completely unaware of these supposedly democratic organizations that actually are radical. Have you seen over the years of your research any improvement, any changes? And if you were to give us examples of the countries that are dealing with these issues the best, so we could look up to them, although it's not ideal, but at least it's a little bit better than others, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Right, before you get lost in all those questions, I'll give you a chance to come back, and then we'll have plenty more time. This time I'll give you first shout, Rakib.
Sure, yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that firstly I'll start with the gentleman who talked about freedom of expression and how it's such a core European civilizational value. But I think I'd make the point that I think the threat here is when Islamist extremists use those democratic values but they use it in a way that actually erodes liberal democracy in the long term. So I think that, like anything, with freedom comes responsibility. And the one value that I think is integral to my understanding of what a British civic nationalism should be is respect for the rule of the law. Now, I know that we talk a great deal about free speech, but again, free speech comes with responsibility, and that's the truth of it. Would you support free speech to the extent that you have the displaying of pro-terror paraphernalia on the streets of London? Personally, I wouldn't. I think that's a very serious law and order issue. I think that more generally, when you're looking at the dynamics in the UK, but in other parts of Western Europe, I think that the main problem here is, and this is something that the lady referred to in terms of how do we tackle it in local communities. You need to call out and expose local politicians that entertain this, and actually that their political careers ultimately rely on it. They need to be well and truly exposed in the strongest of terms, through democratic means, of course. But I think that it's high time. And by the way, this isn't something that I would say this is the preserve of left-wing politics. I think even in the UK, you see fairly conservative, so-called conservative politicians doing very similar things. As well, in terms of entertaining those sort of tribal identitarian interests, which are actually very toxic and pose a fundamental threat to social cohesion. I think the view that I have is that I know that France has a very different context, especially with Laïcité, secular constitutional principle, the model of that sort of colour-blind republicanism, which is very different to what we have in the UK. But I think I'd make the point that if you are an unpersonally a British Muslim academic, if you live as a religious minority, especially a member of a Muslim minority in Western Europe, you're far better off being in Western Europe than in many parts of the world. I don't even see many British politicians making that argument. Quite often they're very insecure, they talk a great deal. And I'm not trivializing anti-Muslim prejudice. I still think there's improvements to be made in the labour market in terms of employment, in terms of housing. But I think quite often they don't have a very optimistic and positive view of the developments and the advances Britain has made in particular in terms of integrating ethnic and religious minorities. Quite often they pander to what I consider to be this sort of a grievance industrial complex where people actually make profit and thrive on peddling these grievance narratives. When in reality I think they need to rise above that, they need to counter those views, and they need to be more confident in terms of defending a country's traditions, its history, its heritage. And the main issue here really is that people who are like-minded in religious minority communities in the UK, they're simply not given the level of empowerment that they deserve. And unfortunately, this is something that Dr. Florence has discussed. Quite often it's the unsavory characters, it's the toxic forces in those communities which hold the most power. And I think that's something that needs to be tackled by state institutions quite robustly, especially in countries such as the UK.
Okay, Rakib, thanks very much. I'm going to take Florence, but then I'm going to come back out to the audience. And I think you've just raised a really key point there, which I would really like the audience views on. So do start thinking about it. It's about essentially what you're saying is an enormous amount of ground has been conceded to basically a bunch of shucksters who are selling some really bad ideas and some really bad.
Yeah, it's not that these ideas aren't rooted in reality. I think that if you make the argument that Britain is one of the most intolerant places on earth, this pseudo-intellectualism is simply not true.
But therefore a huge amount of ground has been conceded. So it raises the question, why? Why has so much ground been conceded? What's gone wrong there? And obviously you can answer that as well. But I'm really keen to hear from the audience, not just your questions, but your points of view as well. Florence.
I mean, this is a debate which lasts for, I don't know, 30 years at least. And we give much money, we try to... but the result is that in England, as like in France, we have two very different models of integration, but we have the same problems. So maybe we should look somewhere else. And so we have two forces, like, for example, wokeism, which make our youth completely insecure towards their culture, their traditions. They are making them hating what they are. And after that, you have the Islamists who are coming and they take what they find. People insecure, and they say, okay, you are going to be very well structured, a God thing to you, and it's very easy. So we are treating the problems by looking at ourselves all the time, and we are unable to look that there are other forces which are attracting for others, and which may be finally a political choice. Maybe people will choose theocracy, and if we don't want to look at that now, it may happen. We have a writer in France, his name is je sais même plus trop. La soumission, Welbeck. Voilà, Welbeck, ouais. And who described France under the authority of Muslim, and who become Muslim. And when you read it, I mean, it's not that far. It's not that far. It goes through the university, which really well seen. So it's not that far. So now we need to look in a different way. We need to understand that these people are not mad, are not stupid, are not strange foreigners. They have a model. They have something which is strong enough to destabilize our society. I come to the first question, the Emirates. So yes, you have in Muslim world some countries like Saudi Arabia, Emirates, who are very strongly against the Muslim Brotherhood, but because they feel that they can be threatened by this, their ideology, their own ideology, is not that far from those of Muslim Brotherhood. So I don't trust them to fight against this movement. And so I know that some people are very well paid to do studies on Muslim Brotherhood by these countries, but it's a mistake. We should not go this way. They have not the same interests as us. So for the political aspects, what can we do for making our politics more aware and more responsible? I give up. Honestly, I give up. Because I think it's not the right level. I think it's not the right level. What the Muslim brothers do is to go through the culture, is the economy. So one important level is the economy, the halal market, for example. We have to make sure that people who go through the halal market know exactly where they are going, because of course the norms, the norms of life, of eating, of dressing, of going to holidays. So we have to explain that our industry, our enterprise should not go this way, should not collaborate with this market, because this is a non-Muslim market and goes which organize the markets. That is for the economy. For the culture, it's the where is it expressing this Islamic culture in our university, in terms of mœurs. I don't know how you say mœurs. In the hospital, for example. So when I present my book in France, all over France, I meet people. They all have a story about a problem with Islamism, for themselves, for their sister, their son. And so the citizen, the right level is the information and the training to the citizen. You're right to reject this culture, because you're right, there is an intention behind it. You're not racist, you're not Islamophobic, you're just a Democrat who doesn't want a theocrat. And if you help people this way by arming them, by not arming this,
yeah, providing them with the arguments, is what you're saying. Yeah.
You will make them stronger, and this is the right level, I think, for fighting, before to have to fight really.
Okay, so that's actually a really great question for everyone to be considering. Is it's not perhaps just simply a question of education. It's who's prepared to fight that fight, who's prepared to make those arguments, who's prepared to stop being insecure and defensive about everything that's happened in the past, and rather than celebrating some of what's happened in the past. Yeah, who's prepared to take that on? And at the moment, it would seem not very many. Right, I've got...
question, I think,
oh, sorry, just one more question, then I'll come back to the audience.
So the government, France is doing things. This law, separatism law, which is not very efficient, I must say, but against the jihadism, it is quite efficient. Austria also has taken some measure, like they open a center of documentation on Islamism, so they take Islamism as it is. Even in France, sometimes it's difficult to say the word Islamism. They don't want to say it. For example, After the 7th of October, there was French who were assassinated in Gaza, in Israel by Hamas, and there was a ceremony, and the president didn't pronounce the word Islamism of the Hamas. So behind the Hamas, there is this ideology of Muslim Brotherhood. So if we don't say it when it's time to say it, we are really far behind. So in England, I think that there is a good knowledge of, like you demonstrate, but very. It seems that even more difficult for you in England than for us, because it's not. I mean, I don't know the reasons, but my English colleagues are brilliant and very clever on these issues, but they are not able to do anything.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Right, I've got Frank Furedi, our Executive Director, and then take a range of... I'm going to take those who haven't spoken first.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great introductions. It seems to me that the real problem lies with ourselves, in the sense that for many, many decades, European elites and European societies have been very reluctant to stand up for what they believe in, where they come from, and have, in a sense, undermined the capacity of people to be able to deal with the kind of pressures that come from the Islamist quarters. And one of the things, I'm also an academic before I'm doing what I'm doing now. I probably still am. Well, I remember doing some research where basically I had my PhD students go to some of the northern English towns and talk to white working class people and discuss with young Muslim second generation kids at the same time. And all my students came back and said that the young second generation Muslims came across as much more confident, much more prepossessed, much more self-aware than the white working class kids. In other words, they had a far stronger identity about who they were than the British ones. And in my research since then, going around other parts, Germany, France, elsewhere, you find the same kind of phenomenon. In other words, you don't need to have a PhD to understand that if you don't have values that are strong and you don't believe in them, then of course the other side will walk through essentially open doors. And that's what's happening in politics. You see, this year I think there's a big change, because I read that in southern Spain there's an Islamic party being formed that's doing quite well. I actually was reading what they were saying. They were telling the Spanish people, don't worry, we're going to be, not a theocracy. We're not going to want to convert everybody in where we are. We're just going to basically run the town. And you have a situation where Erdogan goes to Germany and basically tells Muslims in Turkish people in Germany that they should have separate parties and they should vote very differently. A situation in Britain where there's a by-election in Rochdale today, not today, but fairly soon, and you can tell that the Muslim politicos are essentially controlling the outcome of that election. And I can give you loads and loads of examples where, in terms of our politics, or a democratic political system, there's already a very, very powerful influence there, where people don't use the word theocracy, but the theocratic ambitions that we're seeing are insinuated within all these institutions. So for me, the really important thing is to call this out. And the thing that I struggle with is so many of my colleagues, smart, intelligent people, when I tell them this, when I say this is going on, they say, okay, Frank, you're probably right, but you can't say that because that's Islamophobia. And all I can tell them is to get a life, because unless we call what things are by their right name, unless we kind of call them out, this thing is just going to kind of continue. And therefore, I really hope that people like ourselves and others do take their courage pills a little bit more frequently, because unless we do that, we are going to be in deep, deep trouble. And I think we already are. That's why I think what the two of you are saying and doing is really so important, because we are sensible people. We're not extremist in what we're doing. All that we're saying is that there's a danger out there, and we don't want to end up the way Rome did, where it kind of implodes internally and disintegrates and unravels without anybody having to conquer it from the outside.
Okay, so we're in deep trouble, so very keen to hear from you, the audience, before we come back to the speakers, how we might approach this along the, whatever your take is. I'll take Christina, please, at the front, and then I'll take Jacob, and anybody else who wants to have a go. How do we get out of this deep trouble?
So we talked about how to fight the brotherhood or brotherism at the national level, but what about the European level? Where in fact it's a global movement, and Europe is pushing legislation that is on hate speech, so that would favor the brothers. Yep.
Okay, so hate speech, great point. Jacob, please.
I'm glad that Frank and also the panelists kind of raised the point of courage, or its inverse of cowardice, because I think I was trying to get a handle on what is it that unites these phenomena that we're talking about in terms of both the kind of brotherism, of the kind of declining faith in things in the nation state that Rakib was talking about, and then what we had as the title of this event, which was kind of migration and public security. And it seems to me that a failure of courage and also giving into a deep fatalism is really what unites both things. People, when it whether it's about Islamicization or whether it's about not calling out that we need stronger border protections, it's a question of courage. People have to stand up, be prepared to call these things out, and be prepared to find like-minded people to campaign them on. And also at the same time, we have to challenge what I think is maybe even a more dangerous thing surrounding this, which is fatalism. Lots of people, when you, as was alluded to, when you raise these issues, they kind of throw their hands up and say, well, nothing can be done. We've heard this many times before. Isn't it all going on with regards to the Islamic question? And similarly, we hear the guys who are in charge of running Frontex, the EU's border agency, saying there's nothing to be done about the EU's borders because we just have to accept as many immigrants as want to come here. And I think that to really challenge this, we have to kind of reclaim our courage a bit and also challenge this pervasive sense of fatalism that there's nothing to be done about it, because we can obviously control our borders. Plenty of countries do it, and we can also call out and use the tools available to us to kind of put a stop to this infiltration that we've been talking about.
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else? Right, got this gentleman here, please, at the back row.
Thank you. Just want to re-ask a question that has not been answered to. Where the money comes from, where it goes in. Thank you.
Thank
Just
you.
simple as that.
And just take one. Oh, yes, please, here.
I wanted to know in France, in the UK, and Belgium, the normal Islam population, in how far are they aware of the Muslim Brotherhood? Do they implicitly support them, ignore them, or what's like ideology behind? Is there support or not?
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And I will take you. I just wanted to check there's nobody else. Right. Yes, gentleman here in the red. So we're going to collect them all up and then you can answer all of them in one big go.
Yeah, hello. I'm Karel de Koning from Brussels Signal. Maybe a bit journalistic question, but Dr. Florence, you earlier talked about all political parties in Brussels are infiltrated. Could you elaborate on that, please? And also, last week there was an event in the Brussels Parliament where a radical imam started to sing a surah on fighting the Jews, essentially. Is that subtle? Because you said the Muslim Brotherhood is subtle. So is that connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, or is that just the state of affairs in Brussels that is going south for a very long time and now we're here?
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks ever so much. So we've got, am I missing anyone? This lady at the front here in the purple jump, have this lady? Yeah, great. Sorry, yes, this lady here. Thank you, Philip.
No, one thing occurred to me that's being advertised right, left, and center, pardon the pun, right now is the integration of sports and teams coming out of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Gulf and the soccer and all of these things. And that doesn't have to do with migration, but it does speak in some way to what you're talking about in this infiltration of, I find it very interesting, and I'm wondering what you think. Is this a positive? Is it a negative? And does it What is it bringing to the table in of the Western world besides money?
Okay, thanks ever so much. Right, now, I just want to ask you one question as well to round up, because Jacob touched on it. And we kind of framed this session, about security. We talked about terror attacks. In the way in which we framed the advert, we talked about terror attacks. We talked about increasing gang violence. I mean, it's a big thing in Sweden, for example. And we've seen violence spilling out in Eritrean rival factions in The Hague just the other weekend. It was in London. Camberwell, South London, in Stuttgart back in September. So we talked a lot about, and we also talked about predatory sexual behaviour, which has been raised by quite a lot of people. So we framed all of this in terms of, if you like, security. And we've ended up with a really fascinating conversation about what on the surface appears something slightly different in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood, and you're emphasising their means are, if you like, peaceful. They work within the law, for example. So my question to you both is, I mean, this has been a great conversation, a very important conversation, I think we can tell. But how distinct are those two things, or are they actually part of the same problem? Because we haven't addressed very much the issue that we started with, and I just wonder if that's because this was more important to address as the conversation unfolded, or whether the two things are part of the same problem. Right, so give you 3 or 4 minutes each, because you've got lots of questions. We'll start with you, Florence, and there was a question that was asked twice on where does the money come from.
If you declare a war to a country, you want the country to be as weak as possible. So yes, there is a link between the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, the Brotherism, and the question of security, migrants, because they obviously have interest in facilitating migration, high level of migration, to destabilize and to make Muslims. So this is very clearly said. All what I say is not. It is very clearly said by Youssef El-Qaradawi. From the financial aspect, so I identify 3 main funding to the brotherism in Europe and in France in particular. So the Qatar, Turkey, and the European Union. So of course we can do something for that. European Union is one of the first target of the Muslim Brotherhood when the UK entered in the EU. It was in 1973, and they started to talk about the opportunity of going to influence the institutions. So it's well thought, and then you have two. But I don't want to go into too much details. But there is 2 phases. The first phase is they arrive as a representative of Muslims in Europe, but very quickly it appeared that they were close to the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and all this. So they decided to change their face, and now they go through anti-racism, anti-Islamophobia, anti-discrimination, and it's the way they capture a lot of money. So there is something to do, and we can do about that. What do Muslims think about the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood? First, they don't know it exists. They think it's Islam, so that's the problem, because Muslim Brotherhood make them feeling guilty if they don't practice the Islam the way they want. So, and they are under control. They are under pressure because it's sort of harassment to the Muslim to make sure they will stay Muslim and not go out. The problem is when you have a religion going from one land to another, a Muslim land to another, I mean, naturally, and if the other is secularized, it's normal that a lot of them quit the religion. So they make sure they will never quit, and they will reinforce what they are called their identity of Muslim. So it's very difficult for them. to resist. I said all political party. I said French side party are infiltrated because it is impossible to win anything in Brussels, to win any elections without the Muslim vote, and the Muslim vote is controlled by the brotherists, the brotherism and the brotherists. I wrote a book about that, which is called Cacher cet islamisme. So maybe you can read this for more details. Qatar Airways, Sport, and all the sponsor, AG Plus, all these channels to. It's interesting. For example, AG Plus. This is the channel of Al Jazeera for young people, and it's a very wokist channel to make sure that people will really lose, the youth will really lose his brain, and AG after when you're adult, then it's Islamization channel. So it's very well thought again.
Great, thanks ever so much. And Rakib, please.
Sure, I think I'd take on the lady's point here about what is the sort of mainstream Muslim opinion in European countries, including the UK, towards Islamist extremism. I said previously that there has been polling which suggests that they're actually concerned about the threat of Islamist extremism, and the level of concern is actually very similar to the wider general population. But I think where the mainstream dynamic is among British Muslims is that they're anti-Islamist, but they're also very socially conservative. And if I could explain by that, is that they may be supportive of liberal democracy, participating in elections, but they may see features in mainstream culture which they find, which are alienated by, which they can't really relate to. So I'll give you an example. In 2021, for the first time in the history of the records in England and Wales, the majority of babies were born outside of marriage in England and Wales. And I'm sorry, you're just not going to have many socially conservative Muslims relate to that at all. So I think that the debate about assimilation, I think the question is what you're asking people to assimilate into. And I think it was the point that Frank made about how white British working class people, they were less confident in their identity and their sense of belonging than second generation British Muslims. Comes as no surprise to me. If you're a British Muslim child, you're more likely to have both your mum and dad at home than the average white British child. You're actually more likely to have a stronger sense of faith. In the UK, Christian identification has plummeted over the last 20 years. So across England and Wales, in 2001, over 7 in 10 residents in England and Wales identified with Christianity. It dropped down to 46% in the most recent census, 2021. That's not because of immigration, that's because there's been a rapid secularization of the white British mainstream. And I think that when you look at British Muslim communities, and I'm not romanticizing it, there's very clear problems. We've discussed many of those problems over the course of today. But there's a sense of community spirit, a sort of family-based belonging. There's an attachment to faith which can be a source of optimism and resilience. And unfortunately, that's been lost and that's been eroded in the mainstream culture back in the UK. So I think that in terms of moving the debate, of course, there's certain sort of what I call boundaries, respect for the rule of the law, appreciation of democratic choice, equality of opportunity. These are fundamental cornerstone values of British democracy. But I think there needs to be a broad debate about what should British culture be? How do we move forwards collectively? And I do think that there's certain features in mainstream culture which actually make it very unappealing for more conservative-minded minorities to integrate into and be connected to.
Great. Thank you very much to both our speakers. A round of applause, perhaps? So, just before we depart for wine, I'm just going to ask my colleague Jacob to say a few words. We talked a lot about the importance of courage, about the importance of democracy, free speech. So now's time to hear about our next event and why it's important. Thank you, Jacob.
I think some related things, but I mean, one of my favourite activities to do in Brussels when speaking to the kind of people that maybe not in this room, maybe more mainstream European institutions, is to tell them that I'm a populist, and I enjoy seeing their faces kind of contort in horror when I do so. And with our next event is Europe's Future Populist on the 21st of March. We want to dig in really to why does kind of the associated movements with of populism elicit such horror from kind of mainstream politicians, and it's whether from the kind of farmers' protests right through to the predicted results of the upcoming European elections. It's a kind of like boogeyman on everyone's lips, and we think at MCC Brussels that actually the elites should take a long, hard look at themselves and maybe think why it is that they've provoked such populist reactions. And so digging into what populism is, where it's come from, what role our elites have had in kind of driving it, and whether it might be a good thing is what we're going to do at our next event, which will be an afternoon conference on the 21st of March. So I hope we'll see you there.
Okay, thanks so much, Jacob. Yeah. Okay, so thanks again to Florence and to Rakib, and please enjoy some wine and some, I think there's some light bites there. We can carry on the conversation.